More News Talk Saga 960. So very glad that you could join us on this edition of the Mark Petronas Show. So much to talk about with Tom Quiggin, whether you're talking about the Ukraine war or more recently, Canada's promise to spend more money on the military. Tom, of course, is as an expert on military intelligence, having been having his talents used, for instance, in court proceedings and the rest of it. He's a court-appointed expert in the field, and always a pleasure having Tom on the show. He also happens to be a published author of fiction that, some say cuts awfully close to reality. Welcome to the show, Tom Quiggin.
Hi, Mark. Always good to see you, and thanks for inviting me back.
All right, let's talk a little bit about the budget. Promises to spend more money on the military. Obviously, he's been under some pressure from his NATO partners to do so. Specifically, we saw that during the Trump administration, where he was saying, "Hey, all you other countries in NATO are not pulling up your weight." He was not only including Canada in that. Obviously, he was really taking digs at, say, the Germans and others in Europe, who, of course, were the beneficiaries of America's defense spending. They weren't cutting it, and so he put pressure on them. And now, of course, that we're in the midst of this Ukraine war, courtesy of Russia's invasion of that country. Well, now all of a sudden, everybody's talking about the importance of military spending. Are you buying this apparently renewed commitment by the Trudeau regime to spend more money on the military in this country?
No, I think, Mark, it's going to be a matter of show me the money. It's one thing to say you're going to spend the money. It'll be something else to do it. If people want to think back to Mr. Trudeau's first term in office, in about the middle of that term, he came out with this wonderful defense spending plan. And it was aircraft, and it was ships, and it was more troops and more equipment and all this good stuff. And the defense lobby groups of the day lauded Mr. Trudeau for this wonderfully insightful program and the great way he was going to rebuild the military and all that. But of course, if you actually looked at the fine print, back when he put this plan out, was it 5 years ago or whatever, it said, all the spending would actually be in the next term. And of course, we're now into the second term, which is now gone, and we're into the third term. And none of that money that he promised in the first term ever got spent. So my feeling is he's under pressure from the outside. He's under a bit of pressure from some Canadians to make it at least look like we're trying to do something. So there'll be a bunch of promises made, a bunch of down the road, decisions will be launched. My feeling is as long as this Ukraine thing stays on the front page, Trudeau will put this sort of stuff and say, oh, yes, we're going to increase spending. We're going to increase troops. As soon as Ukraine goes off the front page, he'll go back to, we need to spend more stuff on social justice or, what kind of washrooms we're supposed to use or those kinds of issues.
Okay, so where's the greatest need? I mean, I'm sure you could point to a number of areas where Canada needs help. I mean, there's talk once again of the F-35, so the fighter jets are going to be on the agenda, so billions of dollars spent on those. Where do you see where Canada could get the most bang from its buck, if in fact there is actually going to be more money put in the military?
Well, interesting you bring up the F-35s, Mark. A lot of Canadians tend to forget that we actually need a highly capable fighter to operate in our northern climes, not necessarily for Canadian reasons, but to our south lies America, a superpower, a country with some pretty broad interests. And when they look at a map of North America, what they see is this big blank spot called Canada. And if there is going to be Russian air power headed towards America, be it missiles, be it manned bombers, be it strategic missiles, whatever, they're going to come over the Canadian North. That's the shortest distance between 2 points. So from a Canadian point of view, you never hear it discussed, but the reality is we need a fighter capability in the North. And if we don't provide one, America will. I'm quite certain if we do not at some point get a replacement for the F-18 and put them deployed in the North, America will provide us with theirs. And we won't have a lot of room to talk about it. The other problem, of course, is everybody's saying that Putin is expansionary. He's pushing out. He wants to move into the Arctic. He wants to move further into Europe. And the reality is Canada has just about zero capability of defending the Arctic, either from a submarine point of view or from a above ground point of view. The Canadian Rangers are great for what they do. but their defense capability is quite limited. So I think, at the end of the day, what does the greatest Canadian need? It's sovereignty. We need to at least maintain our own sovereignty. Now, to take that one step further, if Canadians, generally speaking, think we should be involved in things overseas, Cyprus, the Golan Heights, the Sinai Desert, Iraq, Ukraine, Canadians are always saying we should be involved in these things overseas. Well, I don't know if you noticed, there was a decision by the Americans to involve some other countries in their hypersonic missile testing. So they invited countries like the United Kingdom and Australia, who are our so-called Five Eyes partner. Canada wasn't invited. There was a big conference on Ukraine a couple of weeks ago. Canada not invited to the first one. There's been discussions about greater military cooperation in the Pacific, involving Australia, New Zealand, and a few others, especially America. Canada not invited. And quite frankly, although we're supposed to be a Five Eyes partner, we're supposed to be part of this Canada, America, United Kingdom, Australia, New Zealand partnership, we're just not getting invited to things lately. And I think the reason is we don't participate in anything. The last time we participated in a meaningful way in an operation was probably the bombing of ISIS. And as soon as Mr. Trudeau got into power, he took us out of that. And then the only other sort of foreign foray, if you will, was into Mali. And that was one tour, a relatively modest contribution into a sort of a difficult area. But that's been it. We're non-contributors because, we don't have the equipment, we don't have the money, we don't have the personnel quite often. So Canadians, I think, have to get used to the idea of Canada as a non-participant, unless we're actually willing to get into the fight, in which case, we need to start looking at the ability to project power and the ability to involve ourselves with the allies.
Right. So at the moment, given our lack of spending, we're all hat, no cattle. And so when Trudeau prances around Europe with his film crew, showing everybody how involved he is and how engaged he is, and trying to turn the page on the debacle from his vantage point of crushing the convoy and imposing martial law in Canada, he doesn't impress too many people, which is something that certainly explains why we were left out of key discussions with the United States and the Brits over the containment of China, over Taiwan, and with our European friends as well. When Biden was having discussions with them, again involving Boris Johnson, Macron, and others. They were talking, but Justin Trudeau finding himself on the out. So either people don't personally treat him as a guy with much substance, or they just see Canada in general as a non-player. Either way, the old talk about Canada being back has never been so wrong. We are nothing burgers right now on the world stage. But I want to ask you, speaking of Justin Trudeau, you wanted to discuss this and go into a little bit of depth around the discussion of Justin Trudeau as a dictator. This is a story that we really talked about at length last week. And so it was really sparked by a discussion by a Conservative member of Parliament, Rachel Thomas from Lethbridge. This lady stood up and basically described the situation. I mean, specifically, I don't want to put words in her mouth, but saying that many Canadians see him as a dictator. I think it was a very fair point, but it really got the bought off media's hackles up, and they started attacking her, and even some members of the Liberal Party caucus backbenchers, some of the trained seals back there, like Mark Garretts, and these people standing up and, whoa, the righteous indignation. How could you possibly even think such a thing? After all, then you're suggesting that Trudeau is in the same category as Vladimir Putin or one of these other people. And I want you to weigh in on this, because my take is he may not be a dictator of a dictatorship, but his mentality is that of a dictator, meaning a guy who wants more power, using every lever at his disposal, including martial law, to centralize more power in the hands of the government. And guess what? When you're grabbing more power, who are you grabbing it from? You're grabbing it from the people, the citizens who used to have a lot more say over their own affairs. You want to weigh in on this matter?
Yeah, I think it's worth noting that, she made this comment in passing, and she said words to the effect that Justin Trudeau fits the definition of a dictator. And I would have to say, even by the terms of today's rather partisan debates, shall we say, that's quite a statement to make. But two things kind of really jumped out at me. One is True North News came out and said here is 11 different examples where the mainstream media or whatever referred to Prime Minister Harper as a dictator. And guess what? No blowback, no upset, no nothing like that. But of course, one comment that Trudeau is a dictator, and it causes this absolutely fury of outrage. So if the mainstream media is still trying to say it's neutral and it's unbiased, it's whatever, it's like, well, there's another case example of how you kind of blew the situation, that you should have been defending Harper as not a dictator if you're going to defend Trudeau as not a dictator. But anyway, the other question, of course, is she accurate? Is it a fair statement to make that Trudeau has the makings of a dictator, whatever? So my answer to this would be, is he a dictator? No. However, I would say he's moving Canada in the direction of a dictatorship. His nature, his organization, the way he sets up his office, the way he's doing stuff is exactly that. He's centralizing power. Parliament is becoming almost irrelevant. Question period is almost irrelevant. With this latest NDP liberal sort of, I know we're not supposed to call it a coalition, but it's a coalition by any other name. All power that the committees had in Parliament are being sort of seriously undermined. Also, Canada is supposed to be a Westminster model of Parliament. This is how we're supposed to function. That is the roots of our democracy. And in that model, Parliament is supreme. Not the Prime Minister, not the Cabinet, not the Governor General, not the Chief of Defence Staff or the head of the RCMP. The Supremo is supposed to be the will of Parliament, and that's what makes the final decisions. Justin Trudeau has effectively, seemingly broken that. And he did it with the Chinese spy scandal. I mean, we've referred a couple of times to, the reality is China infiltrated our high-end biolab in Winnipeg. They stole a bunch of material. They put a couple of spies in there. They sent stuff home. We got robbed by Chinese spies. Simple as that. But when the parliamentary committee investigating this demanded the government provide documents, Trudeau said no, refused it, and then sued his own speaker, saying that the Prime Minister's office and the government didn't have to give up these documents, thus challenging the supremacy of Parliament. Now, interestingly enough, right after that, Parliament got prorogued. There was another election, so the issue kind of died. But Parliament expressed its will as a supreme power, and the Prime Minister's office rejected it. So a multi-hundred-year tradition behind the idea that Parliament is supreme and the Prime Minister isn't seems to have kind of died, and not a whole lot of Canadians have picked up on this. Now, lots of other problems out there, of course. The press, mostly bought off, as we've pointed out in the past. They've got a ton of money up front from the handout. They got more money from the advertising. And more interestingly, we're not even allowed to know which organizations got how much money, because, that's secret for some reason. And if we're supposed to have a functioning free press and a functioning democracy, one of the things we should know is how much money is the press getting from the taxpayer? And the answer is we're not allowed to know. The Royal Canadian Mounted Police, for instance, have been so heavily politicized that many people now see it as a state police force that expresses the will of the Prime Minister's office, rather than a police force that defends the Constitution and the people. And I think just this past week it came out, RCMP recruiting is down about 50%. Why? Well, apparently people don't want to join the RCMP anymore, which is a staggering thought. I used to be a contractor for the RCMP, and I can tell you, when I worked for the military and I phoned up foreign powers and I asked for help, I'd get maybe some, maybe not. If I was working for Privy Council office or Citizenship and Immigration, I'd phone up and I'd ask for help, and I may or may not get help. But if I phoned up and said, look, I'm a contractor working for the RCMP, bang, doors opened. The RCMP had a great reputation internationally as being a high-end, highly capable, highly trustworthy police force. But over the last several years, that's gone downhill, as shown by, the recruiting, that, people just don't want to join the RCMP anymore because it's not their once great force it truly was. And that's damaging to Canada. It's damaging to our democracy. And there's a whole ton of other examples. We could go into Elections Canada. The way they went after Rebel Media for publishing a book they didn't like was one of the most anti-democratic things I've ever seen. And Elections Canada, by their own admission, botched 205,000 votes in the last election. And this is their own report, by the way. And those 205,000 votes were greater than the margin of victory between the two powers. And it's like, how can that happen in a quasi-democracy that Canada is supposed to be, or still supposed to be? But anyway, Mark, all of that to say, I don't think Trudeau can be called a dictator. And just we should make this clear, as a democracy slides from being a democracy towards a dictatorship, it's not usually an event. It's a process. It's a process that occurs over a number of years. So one of the models to look at is Venezuela. I mean, if you said, what's his face, Chavez was a dictator in 1999, that would be an unfair statement. He was a strong man. He's a bit of a thug. He was a bunch of things, but he'd been elected. There was some accountability, et cetera, et cetera. He wasn't a dictator. But if a few years later, let's say 10 years later, if you're trying to argue Chavez was not a dictator, then you were just wrong. He took Venezuela in about 6 or 7 or 8 years and took it from a relatively well-functioning, relatively prosperous democracy and turned it into a socialist dictatorship where people were eating their own pets and you had to weigh your money in a store. I mean, the currency lost all its value. So I would think it's probably better to look at Canada as a process and say, Trudeau is taking us down a path from where we were a world-beating democracy to a point now where it's reasonable to have a discussion whether PMO has dictatorial powers and whether Trudeau will maintain himself in power by suppressing the media, by suppressing Elections Canada, by suppressing the internet, which he's working at right now, and suppressing any sort of opposition, as we saw with the convoy. So unfortunately, I think in fairness to the member of parliament, what was her name? Rachel Thomas.
Rachel, yeah.
Yeah. She was right to raise the question. And it's a very uncomfortable, very, it's a terrible thing to raise in a place like Canada. But I think she's right to raise it. And the answer to the question is, yeah, that's the direction we're moving in, Mark. And it's not good.
Tom Quiggin joining us on Saga 960. So very glad to have Tom on the show. He's a military analyst expert, a court-appointed expert. He's a published author, has a resume that would make most people green with envy if you were of that type of person to be green with envy about anything. But he's got tons of experience. He's also a student of history. That's one of the reasons why we love having Tom on the show. And we've been talking about whether or not Justin Trudeau really warrants the label dictator. I personally think, if you're asking, and I have voiced this opinion, he's a dictatorship of a country that's not a dictatorship yet. He's a dictator of a country that's not a dictatorship. So in other words, he's like Chavez. He's a guy who's pushing the country in the direction early on, as you mentioned. I mean, when Chavez showed up on the scene, he didn't say, okay, I'm a dictator, everybody. I'm taking over. Hope you're happy about it. I know Iran is just a socialist and populist, but I'm here now. I'm a dictator, so whether you like it or not. No, obviously, they're not going to take that approach, right? They're going to get in, and it's boiling the frog thing. It's a cliche that we keep hearing more and more about. You just introduce more and more, I want to say, draconian measures that are designed to strip power away from the people and centralize it in the country, right? And so what we saw, Venezuela turned into a disaster. Thousands of people left. They were like refugees. They went to Colombia and other countries, nearby countries. Many of them came over to Canada. And I'm getting texts and DMs, direct messages from people from Venezuela saying, yeah, we came over here. We've got this T-shirt. Tom, we've already seen how this movie ends, and it's bad. You lose your house. You lose your property. You lose your money. Your money is worthless, right? So, yeah, maybe the government promises you this and promises you that. You're going to have money, but that money is worthless. You're going to need a wheelbarrow to go buy a loaf of bread. We're back into the Weimar Republic days. And this disaster is slowly but surely being played out. And as someone mentioned to me, he said, how fast does that happen when this disaster unfolds? And he says, well, slowly at first for the longest time, and then quickly, you approach the edge of the cliff, and then all of a sudden, boom, you're on your way down, and there's no stopping your fall. There's no breaking your fall because you're going to hit the ground, and you're going to hit the ground hard. So this is why I've been warning people about this. This guy's mentality. You have to look at his attitude, right? Here's a guy who's been attacking the country since the day he took over. I asked this question on my show, Tom. When was the last time that Justin Trudeau actually said something great about Canada? Where are the people who actually build the country up, who want to go out and say, hey, Canada's the greatest place in the world. You should come. You should visit. We've done this and we've done that. No, he never does that. He attacks the country. It's genocidal. It's systemically racist. It's full of Nazis, driving around in trucks. This guy has done nothing but attack the people of this country and denigrate this country almost on a daily basis. And so the idea that somehow he's never once been a champion of this country. And so that to me is a real telltale sign, right? A guy who
Yeah.
spends all his time apologizing for all these things that apparently we've done in the past. Fine. Yeah, we made mistakes. What country hasn't? So this guy is attacking Canada, denigrating its history. He loves to see, statues like that of John A. Macdonald toppled, because he hates the country so much. He wants to destroy its history. He wants to denigrate it. He wants to hurt it. He wants to portray it as something bad, racist, unfair, all this stuff. The guy who pranced around in blackface more times than he can count. He's the one who's going to attack Canada as a racist country. I mean, to me, this guy spends all his time doing that. And that's a telltale sign. If you love your country, you want to build it up, you want to talk it up, you want to sell it to the world. If you hate the country and you want to bring it down, you do exactly what this slimeball is doing. What say you?
It's interesting, Mark. If you go back, I mean, I've been watching Trudeau since basically I started watching him really when he became a member of Parliament. But I think if you want to look at this sort of issue of what is his mentality like, two things jump out early on. The first is when he was running for prime minister the first time, and I think a lot of people remember this, he was in Winnipeg. He was at a Liberal Party event. It was a gathering of, women, female liberals who support Trudeau or whatever it was. And after a friendly discussion, they opened it to the floor for questions, and a woman asked a completely softball question. She put it right over the plate, and she said, Mr. Trudeau, besides Canada, which country do you admire most? And I mean, that was a softball question. He could have said anything, Britain and France because they're the mother countries, Mexico because he likes the weather. I don't know, whatever. He could have said anything. It would have been very easy to answer the question. What he said was he admired China the most, which I found a bit shocking. And then he actually explained that by saying he admired the basic dictatorship. And I just where did that come from? It was a softball question. It had nothing to do with China. But when he talks about countries he admires, what does he come up with? China, and says he admires their basic dictatorship, which was just to me stunning. And then if you remember when Castro died, Fidel Castro, he put out this glowing statement about how Castro had seen wrong and how he had righted the wrongs. And he was this wonderful leader and all this sort of stuff. And it's like, Castro? Okay, you can say he ran a revolution to get rid of foreigners, fine. But then he opened up 50 years of the most brutal, horrific, poverty grinding dictatorship that anybody's ever come up with. Yet this is a guy he says he admires. And then, I mean, just when people remember when he got into power, he was interviewed, I think it was by the New York Times, and he said Canada would be the first post-national country. In other words, all Canada's values, traditions, and history were about to go out the window, and he was going to issue in his new version of what Canada would look like to him. So yeah, none of this is a surprise, Mark. This is embedded right into his DNA. It's been in his policy. It's been in his statements. It's been in his sort of the voice that he uses all the time. It's there. So again, I think Rachel Thomas has asked a completely favorable question, or raised a completely sensible point, and it's something we should be discussing a bit more. Is where is this guy taking our country?
Yeah, we've had a couple of comments here. We just had one from Jerome Hildebrand saying a Colombian friend of mine is talking about moving back to Colombia, and Claude Cornwallis says, let's call him a soft dictator, but he's still a dictator. Yeah, he's a soft dictator for now, and then he's going to become a hard dictator when eventually he gets all the things that he wants. I mean, these people, in the midst of trying to change and fundamentally change the country into a dictatorship, these people are raping the country. They're, the level of corruption here. This is part of the destruction of the country that's going on, is the incredible theft and corruption. We've had billions of dollars disappear, in pandemic money that was supposed to help the country cope with what had happened and the economic effects of the pandemic. What did we get? We got tons of corruption. We got disappearing money that should have been used for infrastructure that is still unaccounted for, Tom. This is how you destroy a country. You run up the credit card, and then you steal from it. These people are raping this damn country, is what they're doing.
It's interesting. If you look around, I mean, just for a few examples, one is the case of the disappearing field hospitals. We keep hearing even now that, hospitals are stressed and the ICUs are full and the beds are, oh my God, we're running out of beds. That they spent several $100 million for these field hospitals that no one ever actually saw one, and none of them were ever opened. And, a huge question, where did that money go? But kind of forgetting that, I mean, it's always fun, or I think it's a worthy point to say, okay, well, the pandemic was bad. It was bad for the economy. How did everybody else do? So when we compare ourselves to our like-minded nations or similar type countries, we look at the Five Eyes intelligence sharing agreement, we look at the OECD, we look at the European Union, we look at the G7, G8, G20, however one chooses to describe that. And by every measurable standard, say, for instance, within the G7, whether it's debt per capita, total spending, percentage of debt as measured by GNP, et cetera, we're constantly coming in number 6, number 7 in the G7. Within the OECD, which is, I think, 34 countries or something like that, we're right down the bottom on almost every measurable statistic. So as the world moves into a difficult period, which is to say the Ukraine war, instability in Europe, and a potential global recession, we're not only not in good shape as we head into, shall we say, a problematic period of time, we're in amongst the worst shape of any of our peer countries in the G7, OECD, those sorts of groupings. So yeah, it's unfortunate that Mr. Trudeau started out when things were good, say from 2015 up to 2019, and got into some absolutely amazing spending, just huge amounts of money being shoveled out the door with very little to show for it. And then during the pandemic market, it was just stunning to watch hundreds of billions of dollars go out the door. And if you look around, what do we have to show for it? I mean, a bunch of people stayed home and watched Netflix. We pay, restaurants to stay closed or whatever, but it was an absolutely stunning amount of capital destruction. It's not like we put everybody to work building new national parks or new airports or new highways or, any of that sort of stuff. It's not like we invested in manufacturing, because we didn't. The Canadian Infrastructure Development Bank just passed its 5-year anniversary. We've spent tens of millions of dollars on this infrastructure development bank. They just gave out something like $5 million in bonuses to the staff of the infrastructure development bank here in Canada. And in 5 years, they've done 0 projects, not a single project.
It's a disgrace. Can I raise something while I got you on the show here? The rankings, the economic freedom, right? This is 2022, latest rankings. The top number 1 country is Singapore, then Switzerland, Ireland, number 3, New Zealand, Luxembourg, Taiwan, number 6. Well, China may be able to destroy that ranking in no time. Estonia, a little tiny country near Russia. And then you got the Netherlands, number 8, Finland, number 9, Denmark, number 10. Guess where Canada is? All the way down to 15. Down, right? Down. So again, Canada is losing ground. Canada's economic freedom score 76.6%, making it its economy the 15th freest in the 2022 index. Canada is ranked first among 32 countries in the Americas region, and its overall score is above the regional world. Over the past 5 years, Canada's economic growth has decelerated, turning negative in 2022, although growth appears to have resumed in 2021. Economic freedom reached a high in Canada, Tom, way back in 2011. That was the year that Stephen Harper and his Conservative Party of Canada won a majority government, and has been declining gradually ever since, weakened by decreases in government spending and fiscal health. Canada has recorded a 1.9 point overall loss in economic freedom since 2017, and has fallen further in the top half of the mostly free category. Rule of law is strong, but government spending remains excessive. This is how you wreck a country, Tom. And it's indices like this that prove that the rest of the countries in the world are taking note.
Yeah. One of the things that runs parallel to this, when you look at countries that are high in economic freedom, they also tend to be the same countries that are very low in corruption. So Singapore, for instance, I lived in Singapore for a year and a half, and it's true. I mean, there is very little corruption there, because if anybody's caught being corrupt, they're just fired, blacklisted, and you never get a job again. Simple as that. And it doesn't matter whether you're a deputy minister of a government department or a taxi driver. You get busted for corruption, you're gone. Simple as that. And Canada always used to rank up in the first top 5 sort of thing. It was always, Canada, Finland, Singapore, Norway, the sort of Nordic countries were always our peer group, and we always rated somewhere in the top 5, top 10 kind of thing, and we move up and down 1 or 2. But the same thing for corruption. As it starts to catch up, Canada's sliding further down the corruption index, making us, more corrupt than we used to be. And with corruption goes goodbye economic freedom. When you lose economic freedom, you also lose investment, et cetera, et cetera. So I would say, it just as kind of a warning, I mean, Canadians really want to watch this year. First off, we've got global problems, which is to say Ukraine, inflation, oil, that sort of stuff. And then we've got some other little problems, like the Canadian economic system just took a hell of a hit during the Freedom Convoy thing, when Mr. Trudeau essentially arbitrarily decided to close a bunch of bank accounts of people. Why? Because he didn't like what they were saying. And that rattled the banking system really badly. Now he's just...
Have you heard that number? A loss of 1.3 trillion lost economic activity, money outflows out of Canada during that time. Did you hear that number?
I've actually looked for reliable numbers and haven't been able to find them.
Okay.
A number of people have spoken on how they're watching money flow out, and they talk about case examples at local or regional levels. But I mean, the reality is, no matter how you cut it, capital is leaving Canada. Canada used to be a net importer of capital when Mr. Trudeau was first elected. Now Canada is a net exporter of capital, and those numbers are increasing rapidly. But right now, you've seen Mr. Trudeau just came out with his new, I don't even quite know what to call it, his new plan for getting rid of fossil fuels and buying more electric vehicles. And when you cut into it, the plan is absolutely asinine. I mean, Rachel Notchley, the leader of the NDP in Alberta, he came out and said he's delusional. And it's like, oh dear, where are you at when you've lost Rachel Notchley?
Yeah, when the NDP is accusing you of being delusional.
Yeah, but I think what's stunning about it is, I mean, one of the economic engines of Canada for the last 20 years or so has been Alberta, the oil industry, as well as, potash and a few other things like that. But he now has a plan that has no actual reality to it. They've just, I think, assigned a bunch of arbitrary goals, assigned a bunch of arbitrary sort of plans to get there. And they keep telling everybody, oh, you're going to save money with these electric vehicles. Once we get there, it's going to be wonderful. We're all going to save money. Well, the reality is, there's nothing in that plan on how are they going to get electricity to people. If everyone's going to be driving electric cars, if like 20% of people are going to have electric cars at some point, this is a staggering amount of electricity that has to be created. It has to be transported, and then it has to be deliverable at source. And nobody really knows. I've seen different numbers, but all of the numbers run into the billions and billions and billions that are going to be needed to be spent to create the infrastructure, to create the electricity and deliver it to the consumer. None of that is being accounted for. So I think what you're seeing is, around the world, people are looking at Canada and saying, is Trudeau really serious about this? Does he actually think he can cut the amount of fossil fuels by 40% or whatever it is?
No, they're laughing at him, Tom. That's what I think.
Yeah.
I gotta wrap it up.
Yeah, okay.
But let's get you back real soon, because I've got to ask you about the move by the Finns now, and others looking at joining NATO. This is something that's, the chicken's coming home to roost for the Russians now. Finland is not a member of NATO. Sweden is not a member of NATO, I don't believe. And so the fact that these countries are now talking about it suggests that they no longer trust the Russian bear next door after what happened with Ukraine. So who can blame those countries for wanting to, look for some sense of protection here from a possible invasion sometime in the future. Tom Quiggin, thank you so much for coming on the show. I really appreciate that.
Cheers, Mark.
All right, Tom Quiggin. And we got to take a quick timeout, commercial break. Back with more on Newstalk Saga 960 and the Mark Petrona Show after this.